John Contini is a man who was a prosecutor. And well, let's talk directly with him. John.
Hi, Joe. How
Thanks
are you?
for joining me here on Praise the Lord.
Thank you, thank you. This is a blessing. Thank you, thank you.
I was captivated by your story, and I wish you would tell our viewers a little bit about your background. You're both Irish and Italian, right?
Yes, I am.
That's an interesting mix.
I am.
Which do you consider yourself to be more of?
Both, so as not to upset my parents who are listening, I'm sure, watching. The Italians were from Ohio, and the Irish were from Boston, and we would go back every 3 years, flip-flop, and so I'm from Boston and Ohio, and both 50% Italian-Irish, and but first and foremost, a believer and a son of God.
Well, just imagine being asked to defend a man who was classified as one of the most dangerous individuals in the country and who allegedly committed 3 heinous murders. In his book, Danger Road, our guest tells a true crime story of murder and redemption. John Contini.
Thank you.
So nice to have you, John.
Thank you so much, Judy. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You are an attorney, and back in 1990, your daughter was born, your little baby daughter, and you thought you would rush down to the newsstand and pick up the newspaper so you could save it for her, because on this day she was born and you were going to save it for posterity. And what happened?
And I ran down to get the paper, and there on the front page that was going to memorialize her birth for someday were all these pictures of deceased murder victims and a picture of Gil Fernandez, who later became my client, but I didn't know it then. I was horrified because he looks very, very menacing. He was a Mr. Florida bodybuilding champion, 270. He could break most men in half. And it was a visual that was just frightening, frankly, and I was angry. I had no idea a few days later he would be my client.
Gil Fernandez was very known in that area. He was a former Mr. Florida in bodybuilding.
Yes, he was Mr. Florida bodybuilding champion, and he was a kickboxing champion, but he was also notorious for being named Miami's meanest cop during the McDuffie riots, voluminous excessive force complaints, a very, very intimidating individual known as Muscle, supposedly for the mob in South Florida. And on many levels, he was quite notorious.
And when you got the call from his father, what happened there? What would even make you want to take on a case like this?
After all, you were really angry.
I was angry, but we were also pretty much broke. We didn't have any. I was new, self-employed. I was out of the prosecutor's office a few years. I had been a former prosecutor. Didn't have any real liquidity or money. I had a new baby now and a fairly new marriage, and the funds weren't there, major surgery bills in the hospital.
I wanted the press, and I wanted the money, and I led him to believe that I was a man of faith like him. I wasn't sold out like he was, and yet I led him to believe that I was.
And I was receptive in the faith, but I was not sold out in the faith. My wife was. And Gil Fernandez had become a major born-again believer. These murders were quite historical. They were 8 years earlier, and some of them 5 years earlier. And he had become a real sold-out major believer, speaking in all the churches, and I wasn't like him. And his father was a believer. They wanted a Christian lawyer. They didn't want some notorious murder secular lawyer, which I had already started winning murder cases, and I wasn't saved. But I lied to him, frankly, and I was a fraud in the faith. I did, and I admit, I deceived his family into believing that I was like him, like them, to get the case. I'm not proud of that, but it is what it is. That's what I did.
It's a fact.
Yes.
It is.
And when so you said yes to the case, you needed the money, and you were going to plunge headlong into this, and then you had to meet Gil Fernandez Jr., who was the most notorious criminal then. And so after meeting him, you concluded his innocence, his guilt, or you don't do that right away? Do you have any sense when you were talking to him?
I think I believed, probably like everybody else in town, that not only was he probably guilty of these 3 murders, but there were about 8 others. Law enforcement said that he was systematically eliminating witnesses against him. Everybody who started dying 2 and 3 at a time were being killed execution style, and they were his own crew members. They said he ran a crew of bodybuilders out of the Apollo gym that would collect debts for the mob, and they would do all sorts of things for the local organized crime.
What happened? Where was the change? I mean, you got knocked down, first of all, in terms of your law career, and you became a defense attorney, but what was it that made you become a Christian?
And he would want to pray with me like this. He would hold my hands and want to pray with me in the jail. And I would be embarrassed in front of all my colleagues in jail. I didn't want anybody to see me. About 3 years ago, I went up to see him, and I confessed to him, and it was torturing me over time.
What'd you tell? This is big, muscular guy. What'd you tell him? I mean,
I had to tell him. I just had to tell him the straight scoop, that I wasn't the real deal like him, that I misled him initially. And he just smiled. He let me off the hook immediately. There was no condemnation, and I was empowered by that too.
You were afraid that if they knew that you were a born-again Christian, that they would look at you differently. How do you feel about that now?
I tell you what, it brings tears to my eyes too often that I could get up. And I had many murder trials, and I used to brag, and we'd get the acquittal, and I'd go out drinking, and I'd celebrate with my friends, and the parents of the deceased are in the courtroom weeping and gnashing of teeth, and we're going out drinking and celebrating. I stopped and bought a Mercedes one time, and I get so convicted to think that over the bones of these people, I'm out celebrating. And what convicted me was I can get up there and run my mouth for an hour and a half to a jury all day long on behalf of accused murderers, in front of all the cameras. No trepidation, embarrassment, nothing. And yet I was embarrassed to speak up for the one who made me and died for me? I mean, how much sense does that make? How much sense does that make? It makes no sense.
I probably believed, like everybody else, that he was in fact guilty of all these things, but frankly speaking, because of where I was too in my faith or lack thereof, I didn't frankly care. One thing is true. There's no way the man got a fair trial.
But it was such, just reading your book, John, and it was so well written, and I encourage anybody to pick up this book. It just keeps you riveted till the very end. But you talked about the courtroom drama. I mean, it was very paramilitary. There were guards everywhere, U.S. Marshals, because of the notoriety of this man. And how was that? And it was televised, national media, local media, and of course the victims' families. How was that?
It really does indict the system too. Prosecutors, and I used to be a prosecutor years before this, we're supposed to seek justice, not convictions. It's very, very clear in the Code of Professional Responsibility. But in real life, that's a bunch of hooey. Prosecutors want to win at all costs, unfortunately, and I was one of them. And sometimes they'll do things they shouldn't do. For instance, knowingly elicit testimony that they know in their spirit, if not outright, is not true, but they want to win at all costs. Lawyers, this book exposes the Machiavellian machinations that we play as lawyers, sidebar, all the stuff that really goes on. They don't talk about on Nancy Grace or Greta Van Susteren in these shows. They don't tell you the real deal. What we lawyers do, the games we play to win at all costs. A series of unfairnesses occurred. In my opinion, although 7 state and federal appeals have been exhausted and have been denied, and it appears from all circumstances, worldly circumstances, that he will be in there for life. And yet we know that what is impossible for man is possible with God. There's a question begged, does he have a right to an appeal? Too much time has lapsed.
And so that's what this story is all about. Danger Road it's about a God of second chances. And for anybody, regardless of what you've done, the Bible says, he who has been forgiven of much, loveth much. So the bigger reprobate you've been, not that I'm encouraging folks out there to go out and sin like I did, but the bigger reprobate you've been, the more that you need to be forgiven of. And the more that you're forgiven of, the more you love. And the more...
That is so wonderful and so sweet and so empowering.
And people, believers, ask me, how can you defend people you know are guilty? And I'm getting that question all the time. And I'm kind of shocked, frankly. My wife says I'm a little too defensive about it. But if Jesus thought that way, we'd all be toast. And what did he say to the criminal on the cross next to him? He said, today with me in paradise. That's it. And I never say in this book that Gil did it, and I never say he didn't do it. I let the readers determine. They're the ultimate jury. But they're more of a fair jury than he ever got. Because in this courtroom, the prosecutors did everything in their power, fair and unfair, to win at all costs. He certainly didn't obtain a fair trial.
What caused you to write the book?
I had no choice. I think the Holy Spirit in me moved me to, I had to write this book. Just like in the scriptures, the apostles were saying they were compelled. I felt compelled that I had to get this out of me. I had to dump my bucket. It's a catharsis of sorts. I wanted to reach folks that, for the kingdom, that otherwise would never read a faith book. Don't give me another Christian book. Don't give me another one. I'm not going to read it. But they'll read this because it's a true crime book like CSI and all these shows, forensics. They'll read this.
Well, that certainly was redemption in your life and redemption for Gil. And you know, I encourage you, and John, it was a wonderful story, and I encourage you to pick up this book. If you know someone who's in prison possibly, it's great encouragement for them. And pick it up, Danger Road by JohnPContini, and you can get it at the website that you see there on the screen. And you know what, John? I think this has the makings of a movie. And I pray that God will bring resources and people to you that would make this into a film, because redemption is all through it.